Edgar Allan, a novel, Chapter 12. As it turned out, the reason Father didn't say anything to the men from the church then was that he wanted to say something to them later, in his own way and in his own time. And his own time was the Sunday that came right after. It was a short sermon Father gave. It started out pretty much like the usual ones, except that about halfway through he began to talk about how the Bible says a little child shall lead them. What Father did without really saying so was make the little child Edgar Allan and them other Negroes. It was nonsense, Father said, to imagine that one child could bring hundreds of others, whole families, into a new town or a new city. A child without a family who could barely speak, who simply wanted the opportunity to live as other children lived. That some people were afraid of a single child was a measure of how some people were afraid of everything the world offered. Father said it was better by far, when walking into an unfamiliar dark room, to carry a flashlight. That way, when something seemed to threaten you from a corner, all you had to do was turn the light in that direction and find out once and for all if it was a threat, if the threat was real or only a shadow. For his part, Father knew that one small child was perhaps as shadowy a fear as he had felt for a long time. It was a good sermon. Father told some people that they were prejudiced. Who didn't know that? But he had told them without making them mad. It was tricky, and I was proud of him, and Mother was too. I looked around as Father spoke and saw some people looking nervous and uncomfortable, and one or two who had sort of funny smirks on their faces. But most people just listened quietly. You couldn't tell what they were thinking. Afterward, not too many of them came up to speak to Father at the door of the church, but it didn't matter. That night, I slept like a rock. Chapter 13. But waking up the next morning wasn't much fun. I could sense something funny the minute I stood up. Everything was quiet inside the house, but outside you could hear a sort of scraping sound. I went to my window and looked down into the front yard. There was Father raking a burned place in the grass, and Mother was down near the grass picking some kind of paper out of the bushes. I got dressed very fast, sloshed a handful of water on my face, beat my hair into place, and ran downstairs. I walked down the path to where Father was finishing with the rake. He looked up from his work, but didn't say anything. I stood there and looked at the charred place. It was a funny sort of burn. I looked one way at it and then another, and suddenly I realized that no matter which way you looked at it, it was the same thing, a cross. There were a few bigger ashes raked to one side of the burn. They must have been part of the cross before it fell over onto the ground and burned the grass. There was a shallow hole at one end of the gray spot. I looked at Father, and he still wouldn't say anything. I thought people only did this in the South, I said. My father thought a minute and then sort of grinned. Well, Michael, he said, we are south of San Francisco. I didn't think this was so funny, but I decided not to say so. Who did it? I asked instead. We don't know, Michael, Father answered, and he couldn't stop smiling. I haven't the faintest idea. It could have been lots of people, I suppose. Father bent down to pick up pieces of burned wood, and we turned to walk back to the house. A moment from one of the windows upstairs caught my eyes, and I looked up. It was Mary Nell, ducking back behind the curtains, but not fast enough to be hidden completely. For some reason, I never thought of telling Father that she had been watching. Perhaps it was because I suddenly noticed how tired he looked as he had been up most of the night. At breakfast, everything seemed pretty much the same on the outside, but if you look hard, you could see Mother's hand shaking as she served the table. You could see she looked nearly as worn out as Father. Neither wanted to talk about the cross or what the papers had been. They tried to pretend everything was okay as usual. Of course, none of this touched E.A. himself, or S.A., or Stephen. I guess they were too young, for one thing, and their playmates were too young to be like Tommy Ditford or Snooty or Fats. Maybe Sally Ann was aware of something in the air, but she wasn't saying anything. I guess there wasn't much she could have said. She was a great teacher, but to take on a whole town is a lot for a 5-year-old going on 6.